The smell of roast turkey lingered as my son said, "Just sit quietly, Mom." Still, I sliced the roll in silence, a mother trained in swallowing things whole. As the scent of browned sugar curled upward, so did the years of silence. While he scrolled his phone, I recalled every meal I made, every mortgage I paid. The same son who once needed me now couldn't meet my eyes. That's when I knew. A mother's silence can be louder than any will reading. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The dining room felt smaller than it used to. Margot noticed the crack in the corner of the wall by the stairs, one she had patched countless times before, but it always seemed to reappear. The chipped paint along the baseboards, the mismatched chairs that creaked under the weight of family, the scent of turkey mingling with the smell of last year's pine wreath on the door. It was all so familiar, but distant, like an old song she couldn't remember the words to. She carried the sweet potato casserole into the room, the dish warm beneath the foil, steam curling upward. The top was perfectly browned, just like she always made it. Her hands were steady as she placed it in the center of the same table where she had sat for years. Back when this house was hers too. Dean looked up briefly from his phone as she set the casserole down. His eyes darted back to the screen before he gave a half smile, the one he always used when he felt obligated to show politeness. "Thanks, Mom." Kelsey barely looked up, her lips pinched in a way that made Margot wonder if she had noticed the casserole at all. Her daughter-in-law's gaze was fixed on her phone too, fingers scrolling absent-mindedly as she chewed. Margot stood there for a moment, waiting for something. A comment, a smile, an acknowledgement of the effort. But none came. She sat down at the edge of the table, close enough to see Dean's face, but far enough away not to impose. Her plate was already filled with a modest serving, and as she cut the roll in front of her, she noticed Kelsey's frown deepening. The clink of silverware against porcelain echoed louder than usual. Margot noticed how everyone seemed to avoid her eyes. It had been like this for a while now, this subtle distance that seemed to grow with every meal, every conversation. The laughter, once abundant, was quieter now, less frequent. The warmth that had once filled the house, a warmth she had helped build, had cooled. But she didn't complain. She didn't say anything at all. Dean cleared his throat, a long, exaggerated sound. Then, without looking up, he snapped, "Just sit quietly, Mom." The words cut through the hum of the table, and for a second, everything stopped. Margot blinked once, slowly, her heart giving a small, unexpected thud. The air felt thick now, too thick to swallow. The moment stretched in a way it hadn't before. Kelsey's eyes flickered briefly to Margot, then quickly back down to her plate. Dean's voice had been sharp, and the words themselves weren't new. It was the way they landed. So much had changed, so quietly, so unnoticed. He hadn't even looked at her when he said it. Margot said nothing. She didn't argue, didn't rise to the occasion of defending herself. She wasn't angry, just quiet. She didn't need to answer him. Instead, she placed the half-eaten roll on her plate and began to cut it into smaller pieces, the knife moving with precision, a simple task she had done thousands of times before. It was almost mechanical, the rhythm of the knife slicing through the bread, the scrape of her fork against the plate. She served herself another bite. No rush, no comment. The silence at the table thickened again, but Margot didn't break it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. Not really. It was just the way it was now. She was no longer a part of this family, not in the way she had once been. The moments she'd thought were warm had turned to ash in her mouth, and now, they simply didn't matter. Not anymore. Dean cleared his throat again, but this time the words didn't come. Kelsey, her eyes still fixed on her plate, only shook her head slightly. The awkwardness lingered like an unwelcome guest, and yet it felt strangely fitting. Margot leaned back in her chair just enough to take in the sight of them, her son, her daughter-in-law, the table between them. And then, without a word, she began to eat. She wasn't going to argue. Not now. Not ever again. The food was cold, but it didn't matter. She chewed slowly, savoring the flavors for herself. Dean's phone buzzed, and without a glance in her direction, he answered it, his conversation drifting into the background. Kelsey muttered something about needing to call the sitter later, her voice flat and indifferent. It was like they had already forgotten she was there. Margot smiled to herself, just a little, then quietly reached for her glass of water. The sound of the ice clinking was almost comforting. And then she thought, just for a moment, how strange it was. All this time, and here she was, the woman who had given everything, who had sacrificed so much, and now she was invisible. The silence held firm, and the last thing Margot did was nothing at all. She smiled again, just faintly, as she went on eating. The air in Margot's living room was thick with the quiet that had come to define the past few weeks. It was a small space, cramped with mismatched furniture that had once held so many memories. The old couch where she'd sat with Dean, the small armchair that had belonged to her mother, the wooden coffee table with deep scratches from years of use. The window overlooked the neighborhood, snow drifting softly past the panes. But inside, everything was still, as though the house itself had become a placeholder for the life it used to hold. Margot sat on the edge of the armchair, the fabric worn and faded under her weight. She waited, her fingers tapping softly against her knee, the steady rhythm of the movement the only sound in the room. She'd made tea, but it sat cooling on the table, untouched. The doorbell rang. Margot's hand paused. She straightened, took a breath, and stood up slowly. It was time. She walked over to the door, her steps measured, then opened it to reveal Abigail Kerr, her financial advisor. Abigail was always punctual, always in control. Today she wore a navy suit, her expression as unreadable as ever. Margot stepped aside to let her in, and Abigail entered without a word, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. "Good morning, Margot," Abigail said, her voice smooth but clipped, as though she had already prepared herself for whatever was about to happen. Margot nodded but didn't reply, instead leading Abigail toward the small dining area where a stack of papers lay on the table. The trust papers from 2019, their corners slightly curled from time but still holding the weight of years of decisions. They were a record of Margot's life, her sacrifices, her love for her son, and now they would serve another purpose. Abigail sat across from her and glanced at the papers. "I assume we're not here for small talk." "No." Margot's voice was steady, though it carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "I need to revise it." Abigail raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any more questions. She had learned long ago that Margot didn't offer more than she was willing to give. With a single fluid motion, she reached for the papers and began to pull them toward her, scanning the first few lines with practiced precision. "Everything to Dean, as we agreed?" Abigail asked, the question more of a formality than a surprise. Margot nodded, but it was a nod of the past, a thing that no longer held meaning. "That was written when I felt respected." She let the words hang in the air, heavy with something deeper than mere disappointment. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, colder. The trust had been made when she had believed in her son, in the future they would share. Abigail continued to read, her brow furrowing slightly. And now? Margot reached for her tea, her hand steady as she lifted the cup to her lips. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the steam curl upward, swirling in the pale light. She had thought about this for weeks, carefully considering each step, each change. She wasn't doing this out of spite, not exactly, but it was clear now, even to her, that something had broken between them. Something that could never be fixed with casseroles or empty words. "I need a change," Margot finally said, her voice low but certain. "I'm changing the trustee. I'm revising the beneficiaries." Abigail looked up from the papers, her eyes sharp with interest. "A new trustee?" she asked, but it wasn't a question of surprise, more of curiosity. "And who will be the beneficiaries then?" Margot sat back in her chair, her fingers curling lightly around the edge of her teacup. "I'll be the beneficiary," she said, the words coming easily. "And the scholarship fund, that's it." Abigail didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered briefly toward the pile of papers again. "The scholarship fund? You're serious about that?" Margot smiled faintly. "I've thought about it for a long time." Her eyes drifted towards the window, her gaze softening for just a moment. "It's better that way. It will do more good." "Are you sure?" Abigail asked, her tone neutral, but with a slight undercurrent of concern. "I've seen you help him so many times before." Margot's smile didn't falter. "Yes, I'm sure. It's time for me to take care of me." Abigail remained silent for a moment, the weight of the words settling between them. Then, she pulled a pen from her briefcase and began to rewrite the terms on the document in front of her. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper filled the room, an odd kind of comfort in its predictability. Margot watched, but she didn't feel the need to say anything more. "The clause?" Abigail asked, looking up briefly. Margot nodded. "Yes. Insert a clause that bars Kelsey from any role. No involvement, no access, no nothing. Not a cent." Abigail paused, considering this for a moment. "That'll make it airtight?" Margot's lips curled upward just slightly. "Air-sealed," she corrected. "No room for anything to slip through." Abigail's lips twitched. She wrote it down, adding the final touches. "I'll have it notarized. Everything will be in order." Margot watched her work, feeling something inside her shift, something that had been buried deep for a long time. It wasn't relief or joy. It was simply a quiet kind of finality. Abigail finished the document and slid it toward Margot, who took the pen, her fingers steady as she signed her name at the bottom. As the ink dried, Margot leaned back in her chair and exhaled, the breath deep and almost satisfied. "I'll file it first thing tomorrow," Abigail said, her tone still as neutral as ever. "You've made your choice. There's no going back now." Margot nodded. "There's never any going back." Abigail stood and collected her papers, but before she left, she paused and glanced at Margot. "I'll make sure everything is handled. You won't have to worry about a thing." But Margot wasn't listening anymore. She stood up, walked over to the window, and stared out into the snow. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, untouched, like a blank canvas waiting for something new to be painted upon it. And for the first time in a long time, Margot felt like she had control. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was simply about taking back what had been taken from her. Her dignity, her life, her choices. It was time to let go. Abigail left without a word, and Margot remained by the window, watching the snow fall, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the glass. She wasn't looking back anymore. Margot stepped into the post office, the familiar scent of ink and paper filling her nostrils. The place was small, tucked away in a corner of town, where the same clerks had worked for years, knowing every face that walked through the door. It felt like stepping back into a quieter version of herself, the version that had spent countless hours here, sending packages for birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, the days when she still believed in the rituals of family, of connection. Behind the counter, Julie Petros looked up from her station, her round glasses perched low on her nose. The years had softened her features, but her eyes were sharp, as always. She gave Margot a warm smile, the kind that spoke of years of familiarity. "Well, look who's here," Julie said, her voice light and teasing. The quiet one herself. Margot smiled faintly, walking up to the counter where Julie was sorting through a pile of outgoing mail. The small bell above the door jingled as another customer left, and the silence in the small space seemed to deepen. "Got something for you?" Julie continued, reaching for a folder, her hands moving quickly. "Here are the tracking numbers for the upcoming deliveries you flagged." She slid the paper across the counter. "All set for the next few weeks." Margot took the list and scanned it briefly, nodding. "Good, everything's ready." She'd spent hours poring over her Amazon account, changing shipping addresses, canceling orders, and placing new ones. Her P.O. box would now receive everything. No more deliveries to the house. No more chances for Dean or Kelsey to intercept or ask about what wasn't theirs. Julie watched her with a raised brow. "You sure about all this?" she asked, her tone almost gentle now. But Margot could hear the concern underneath. She knew Julie had been privy to all the subtle shifts in Margot's life over the past year, had seen the changes in her behavior, the quietness that had crept in like an unnoticed storm. Margot's lips quirked into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes, I'm sure." Julie's gaze softened and she let out a slow breath. "You know, if you ever need someone to help with, well, anything, I'm here." There was a pause before Julie added, almost teasing, "I mean, not that you need help with anything. You've got it all figured out." Margot's smile deepened for a moment. She wasn't sure if it was because Julie understood or because of the odd sense of validation in knowing that someone, even if just one person, noticed the change. "Thanks, Julie, but I think this time, it's better if I take care of things myself." Julie nodded, not pressing any further. She understood, and in that quiet understanding, Margot felt a brief flicker of relief. It wasn't pity she wanted, and certainly not sympathy. Just the knowledge that she was still seen, still capable. After a beat, Margot turned back to the list of deliveries. "I'll cancel 4 of them," she said, pointing to the names on the sheet. "The ones for Dean and Kelsey. And I'll replace them with something for myself." Julie raised her eyebrows at that. "Something for yourself, huh? Gotta treat yourself sometimes." Her voice was light, but Margot could sense a hint of amusement beneath it. She had known Julie long enough to know when the woman was holding back a laugh. "I deserve it," Margot replied simply, her voice steady. "I've been busy taking care of everyone else for too long. Now it's my turn." Julie's smile widened. "I like that. Want me to wrap them? The new gifts?" Margot shook her head, her fingers lightly brushing the edges of the papers in front of her. "No. Gift bags. Easier to carry." Julie nodded, and with a practiced motion, she started to pull the orders together, making sure the details matched perfectly. The packages wouldn't be the elaborate, flashy ones that Dean and Kelsey would expect. No grand bows, no excessive wrapping, just the simplicity of what Margot had chosen. Just the things that were hers now. Once everything was settled, Julie handed Margot the final slip of paper with the confirmation numbers. "All set," she said, her voice a little softer now. "You'll have them in a few days." Margot took the paper with a slight nod, the weight of it a quiet victory. She didn't need to say anything more. Julie had already said enough. There was no need to explain further. Not to her, not to anyone. Not when everything was so clear, so final. As she turned to leave, the bell above the door rang again, and Margot stepped out into the cold, the winter air biting at her skin as she walked down the familiar street. Snow had begun to fall heavier now, thick flakes drifting through the air like tiny pieces of something delicate and fleeting. The streets were empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb. The neighborhood felt quieter than ever, the usual hum of daily life muffled by the snow. Margot walked slowly, savoring the moment, the small triumph that no one could see but her. The weight of the paper in her hand felt satisfying. But even more so was the knowledge that her actions were hers alone. The world was still spinning, and yet, in this small corner of it, she had made something her own. She didn't need to carry the packages yet, but as she neared her home, she knew that very soon, those small deliveries would arrive, each one a reminder of the shift that had taken place. And when they did, they would only be for her. She walked the rest of the way with a smile playing at the edges of her lips, the weight of it lifting her shoulders just a little higher. The New Year's dinner invitation had arrived quietly, tucked inside a folded note, written in Kelsey's precise uniform handwriting. Margot had read it once, twice, then set it down on the counter. Kelsey's words were polite but distant, as though the invitation itself was a chore to be done rather than a gesture of connection. It wasn't unexpected, but the sharpness of it caught her off guard. "Keep it simple, please," it said. A request, not a suggestion. Margot had smiled to herself. She had a feeling what that meant. When the day came, the sky outside was overcast, the kind of gray that seemed to hang heavy in the air, muffling sound. Margot dressed carefully, choosing an old cardigan she had once loved and a pair of simple slacks. She had decided to bring a salad in a plastic tub, a far cry from her usual casserole dishes, but fitting for the occasion. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention, just a quiet offering, simple and straightforward. She loaded the salad into her car, the greens and the vinaigrette nestled together in the tub, and drove the short distance to Dean and Kelsey's house. The streets were slick with the afternoon drizzle, and the houses on either side of the road were dark, their windows framed by pine wreaths and the soft glow of Christmas lights, now a little tired, just like the holiday itself. As she pulled into their driveway, Margot paused for a moment before stepping out. She glanced down at the salad, then at the house. It looked the same, and yet not. Everything felt different now. The air between them colder, heavier, like the snow that still lingered on the ground. But she wasn't about to turn back. She had a role to play tonight, whether they acknowledged it or not. The door opened before she even reached the porch. Kelsey stood there, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes on her face. She stepped aside without a word. And Margot followed her into the house, the familiar scent of roast and spices greeting her like an old, tired friend. Dean was already sitting at the table, his phone in hand, glancing at it intermittently as though checking for something important. He didn't look up when Margot entered, just gave a brief nod in her direction. "Happy New Year, Mom," he said, his voice flat. Margot smiled politely, offering him a nod in return. "Happy New Year, Dean." She set the salad on the table, the plastic tub making a soft clink as it hit the surface. Kelsey's frown deepened just a little as she looked at it. She didn't comment, but the glance she gave the salad was enough to convey her disapproval. Too simple. Too little. Margot noticed the frown, but she didn't let it bother her. She was used to it by now. "You could have just brought a dessert. You know," Kelsey muttered under her breath, but loud enough for Margot to catch. "Salad's fine," Margot replied softly, taking her seat at the far end of the table. She placed her napkin on her lap, adjusting the folds with careful precision, as if the motion itself would bring some small comfort. The conversation around the table continued in a low hum, casual, but filled with a kind of stiffness, a subtle tension that had become their new normal. The clink of silverware, the scraping of plates. It all felt somehow foreign now. No warmth, no laughter. Just the motions, the expectations. Margot took a bite of the salad, savoring the crunch of the greens, the light tang of the vinaigrette. She chewed slowly, almost methodically, as Kelsey and Dean began talking about work, about plans for the new year. It was all surface level, predictable. There were no real questions, no real engagement. She was just a guest, an observer in a home she once knew so well. Kelsey took a sip of her wine, her eyes flickering briefly toward Margot before she leaned in to whisper something to Dean. The words were too quiet to catch, but the tension in the air spoke volumes. Margot didn't react, didn't look up. She kept her focus on her plate, savoring each bite, each moment of quiet. Dean shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Margot before returning his attention to Kelsey. "She's just tired," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as though trying to excuse the stillness that had settled around the table. Margot heard him, but she didn't respond. Instead, she drank some water, the cool liquid slipping down her throat. She wasn't tired, though. Not in the way he thought. She was simply done. Done with the pretending, done with the roles they had tried to force her into. She was no longer part of the performance. The silence lingered for a moment, as if they were both waiting for something, some sign of rebellion, some sign of resentment. But Margot didn't give them that. She only smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips, then took another bite of the salad. Kelsey's frown deepened, but she didn't say anything. She only sipped her wine again, her eyes darting between Margot and Dean. The air between them was tight, the unspoken words swirling in the background. Margot had known this dinner would be uncomfortable. She'd known it would feel like a performance, but what she hadn't anticipated was how little it would matter to her. In the past, she would have worked harder to fill the silence, to make everything feel right. Now, she was content to sit quietly and let them try to figure out what had changed. Let them wonder if she was tired or simply beyond their reach. Kelsey leaned in closer to Dean, her voice barely audible as she whispered again. "She's being off again." Dean didn't respond immediately. He just stared at his plate, his hands clutching his glass as if it could anchor him to something solid. After a moment, he looked up at Margot, his gaze softening. "She's just tired," he repeated, almost like he was trying to convince himself. Margot didn't acknowledge the comment. Instead, she smiled again, the small smile she'd been wearing all evening, calm, composed, and completely untouchable. They didn't understand, and she didn't need them to. What mattered now was that she had nothing left to give them. And that was all they needed to know. The sound of the wrapping paper tearing was the first thing that broke the silence at the dinner table. Kelsey's eyes narrowed as Margot unwrapped the small box, her movements deliberate, her hands slow, almost too slow, as if savoring each small sound of crinkle and tear. Margot didn't rush through the process, didn't try to make it quick or neat. She wasn't performing for anyone anymore. Kelsey was the first to speak, her voice tight with something unspoken. "You didn't have to bring gifts," she said, her eyes lingering on the small package in Margot's hands, as though its presence was something unwanted, something that didn't belong. Margot didn't answer. She didn't need to. Inside the box, wrapped in a layer of tissue paper, was a small card. The spa day voucher for one. Margot held it up between her fingers, its sleek, glossy surface catching the light from the chandelier overhead. She turned it slightly, admiring the clean print on the card before sliding it back into the envelope. She didn't need to explain. Dean glanced over, his voice soft with a hint of something he couldn't quite place. "A spa day?" He frowned, unsure what to make of it. "You sure you don't need a +1?" Margot's lips curled into a faint smile, her gaze steady. "No, it's for me. Just for me." Her response settled heavily in the air, but Kelsey was already shifting in her seat, her expression twisting with subtle displeasure. Margot turned her attention to the second gift, the one she'd been waiting for. She opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. The paper inside was thick, official looking, its edges crisp and clean. As she unfolded the document, Margot could almost feel the weight of it, heavier than anything she'd held in a long time. She didn't look up as she placed it on the table, letting the silence stretch out just a moment longer. Kelsey's voice broke through, sharp now, with a thread of disbelief. "Wait, you bought the lake cabin back?" Margot's smile never wavered. She met Kelsey's gaze, her eyes calm, almost serene. "No," she said, each word precise, measured. "I just took my name off the joint line last year. Then I put it back." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but it wasn't the lake cabin that mattered. It was what it represented. The ownership, the power, the control. The thing that Kelsey had always taken for granted. Dean stiffened beside her, his brow furrowing as he processed the words. His hand gripped his glass a little tighter, his knuckles going white. "What's going on, Mom?" he asked, the question soft but edged with something like a mix of concern and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" Margot didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her glass of water, her fingers tracing the rim slowly, carefully, before taking a sip. The cool liquid slid down her throat, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to quiet, as if the act itself was enough to silence everything else. She set the glass down, her gaze shifting from Dean to Kelsey and back again. The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer, and she could feel the weight of their expectation pressing down on her, could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to explain. But she didn't. "Nothing's going on," Margot said, her voice light, almost teasing in its simplicity. "Just sitting quietly." Kelsey's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief passing across her face. "Sitting quietly?" she repeated, her tone laced with mockery. "Is that all this is?" Margot's smile didn't falter. She didn't need to explain. Not anymore. She had already made her point. The tension in the room was thick now, palpable. Dean shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his plate, his mind clearly racing, trying to connect the dots. But nothing made sense to him. It wasn't supposed to. This was beyond him, beyond his understanding, and maybe even beyond Kelsey's. But it wasn't beyond Margot. She was the only one who truly understood. The moment lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, as Margot leaned back in her chair and took another slow sip of water. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their understanding. She had learned long ago that the only person she could rely on was herself. Dean opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. He closed it again, watching Margot carefully, as though trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between them, how to make sense of this sudden shift in their dynamic. Kelsey, meanwhile, remained silent, her face unreadable, but the tightness around her mouth told Margot everything she needed to know. The dinner resumed, the conversation awkward and disjointed, as though something had broken that couldn't be fixed. Margot finished her salad, slow and deliberate, each bite a small victory in itself. She didn't need to say anything more. She didn't need to explain herself. The gifts she had kept, the changes she had made, they were hers, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in a long time, Margot felt like she was finally in control of her own life again. And the best part was, no one could take that away from her. Not anymore. 2 days after Christmas, while the last of the decorations were being taken down from the tree, Margot moved the heirlooms. She'd waited for the first few days of the new year, when the house had settled into a brittle quiet. The sound of the wind outside rattling the window panes felt almost fitting, a reminder that things had shifted, things had changed. The old velvet-lined boxes, each one filled with precious things. Her grandmother's brooch, the collection of crystal figurines, the hand-carved chess set that had belonged to her father. They were all packed carefully into a leather-bound suitcase. Each item was wrapped in soft, thick fabric, the kind that whispered when it moved. Margot knew what they meant, even if no one else did. Kelsey had never been interested in them, always eyeing them as though they were nothing more than dust collectors. But to Margot, they were memories. They were a legacy. She hired a courier to take them to a private vault in Portland, a place she had arranged with Abigail weeks ago, long before any of this started. The vault wasn't just a storage unit. It was a place for things that mattered, things that no one else could touch, things that belonged to her. As Margot sat in her living room 2 days later, staring out at the now empty shelves where the heirlooms had once been, she couldn't help but feel a kind of strange peace, the weight that had settled in her chest since the divorce had lifted just a little, like the clouds parting to reveal the sun after a storm. She had done it. She had finally taken control, finally claimed what was hers. The doorbell rang. Margot glanced toward the hallway, her body moving instinctively, though her mind didn't quite catch up. She stood, crossing the room slowly, and opened the door to find Kelsey standing there, her hands on her hips, her lips pulled tight in that way Margot had come to know so well. Kelsey didn't greet her. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp, a little too demanding. "The heirlooms. I was planning on borrowing them for the party. You know, for New Year's." Margot blinked, then leaned against the doorframe, the quiet weight of her decision settling over her. She didn't need to explain, not anymore. Not to Kelsey. "They're gone," she said simply, her voice steady. "I moved them." Kelsey's eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing. "Moved them?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Where? Why? They were supposed to stay here." She took a step forward, almost like she was expecting an explanation, as if the world still worked the way it used to, where Margot always made space for her, where she was still the one to fill the gaps in Kelsey's life. "No." Margot's voice was firm now. "They were never meant to be borrowed." Kelsey's face flushed, and for a moment, she looked like she might press harder, demand to know more. But then, she caught herself. "Well, what am I supposed to do?" she snapped, her shoulders stiffening with frustration. Margot took a step back, giving Kelsey space, but the shift between them was palpable. There was nothing left to say. Margot had already made her decision, and there was no room for negotiation anymore. "They're in a private vault," Margot added, her voice calm, almost detached, "where no one can touch them. Not you. Not anyone." Kelsey's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered between Margot and the empty shelves. She didn't understand. She wouldn't. But that wasn't Margot's problem anymore. "Where is this vault?" Kelsey asked, her tone colder now, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "You think you can just hide everything from us?" Margot shook her head slightly. "It's not about hiding. It's about protecting what matters." She held Kelsey's gaze for a moment before adding, "And that's something you'll never understand." Before Kelsey could respond, Margot turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her standing in the doorway, her fingers still gripping the handle. The silence that followed was thick, and Kelsey remained in place, staring at the space Margot had just vacated. But there was no movement, no sound from Kelsey's direction. Margot reached for the kettle on the stove, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She filled it with water and set it to boil, the rhythmic hum of the heating element the only sound now in the house. Behind her, Kelsey's footsteps lingered for a moment longer before they finally faded into the distance, the door clicking softly as she left. Margot didn't look back. She didn't need to. In the quiet that followed, Margot's phone buzzed. It was a message from Abigail. "Your trust now includes real assets, not emotional ones." Margot read the text and allowed herself a faint smile. That was the goal. she whispered to herself. The kettle whistled, breaking the stillness, and Margot filled her cup with steaming tea, the warmth of it spreading through her hands. She leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the snow falling softly against the glass. She didn't need to explain. She didn't need to apologize. She had done what was necessary. And for the first time in years, she felt free. The phone call came early on a Wednesday morning, just as Margot was finishing her cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate swirls from the porcelain. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would arrive, knowing she'd have to follow through. The soft hum of the kettle in the kitchen had been replaced by the sharp ring of her phone, its sudden interruption cutting through the quiet calm she had cultivated so carefully. She glanced at the screen. It was the bank. Margot pressed the green button, bringing the phone to her ear. "This is Margot Whitmore." "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. This is Charlotte from First Savings. I'm calling to confirm that your request to close the joint account has been processed. The balance has been withdrawn, and the account is now officially closed." Margot paused for a moment, letting the words settle. She wasn't surprised. Not really, but there was a certain finality to it, a weight that pressed down on her chest. No more shared finances, no more obligations, just a clean break. "I see," she said calmly, as though she were simply checking off another item on her to-do list. Charlotte's voice came through, polite but a touch hesitant. "We've transferred the remaining funds to your specified account as per your instructions." "Thank you," Margot replied, her voice steady, almost too steady. "That will be all." She ended the call and sat back in her chair, letting the phone rest in her lap. The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating even. For a moment she just stared at the empty space in front of her, the weight of her decision settling in. It wasn't about the money. It was about control. It was about taking back the pieces of her life that had been chipped away over the years. Her mind wandered back to the house repair last year, the one Dean had called her about. She remembered how he had sounded on the phone, so polite, so insistent that she help with the plumbing. She'd agreed then. Her name left on the account for emergencies, just in case. But now, as she had been advised by Abigail, the time for generosity was over. Just as she was about to stand up, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Dean. She clicked it open, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the message. Why did the plumber say the check bounced? Margot's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. The thought of Dean's confusion made her feel oddly lighter. She had anticipated this. She typed a quick response, her fingers moving effortlessly across the screen. "I don't contribute, remember?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then set the phone down on the kitchen table, the soft click of it landing almost like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. She sat back, letting the moment hang in the air for just a beat longer. It felt good. There was power in that small, simple act. She had done it, made the decision that needed to be made, and now the consequences would be on them, not her. Dean's shock, his frustration, even his anger, none of it mattered anymore. Her life, her choices, were finally her own again. The house felt different now, the air clearer, as if a weight had been lifted. Margot stood slowly, moving to the window, her fingers resting lightly on the cold glass. Outside, the world was still blanketed in snow, quiet and untouched. The streets were empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb, their windows frosted from the night before. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel new, like the world was waiting for something to happen. But Margot didn't need to wait for anything anymore. The changes had already been set in motion. Dean's message didn't require a follow-up. It wasn't an invitation to discuss or a call for clarity. It was simply a ripple in the water, an acknowledgement that he had noticed. But it wasn't enough. There would be no more explanations, no more justifications. Not to him, and not to Kelsey. The silence around her deepened as the phone buzzed again, but Margot didn't move. She didn't need to check it. The call would come eventually. The questions would come, but they wouldn't change anything. The account was closed. The decisions had been made, and she was finally free. Margot turned away from the window, the weight of the moment settling in her bones, the quiet satisfaction of having taken control wrapping around her like a blanket. It was a strange kind of peace. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at anyone. It was simply about reclaiming her space, her life, her choices. The house was empty now, except for her. And it was the emptiness that she had been seeking all along. And in that stillness, in that space, Margot realized that for the first time in a long time, she was no longer just surviving. She was living, on her terms. And that was enough. Margot didn't offer casseroles anymore. The first time she'd noticed the absence, she'd been standing in the kitchen, halfway through pulling a tray of lasagna from the oven, her mind wandering back to the days when it felt like those small gestures, the warm dishes, the homemade meals, were enough. Enough to fill the silence, enough to make her feel like she belonged. But that had all shifted. And now she only stood there for a moment longer, the dish cooling on the counter. Then she slid it into the fridge. No one needed it. She hadn't taken a dish to Dean and Kelsey's house for months now. She hadn't even called to offer, and it wasn't out of spite. It was simply that the offers had stopped feeling like something she wanted to do. They were never appreciated, never acknowledged. And after everything, it just felt pointless. Instead, Margot had moved into a new routine, one that was entirely hers. Every Wednesday and Friday morning, she made her way to the rec center a few blocks away. The parking lot was quiet, and the gym smelled like rubber and sweat, but there was something refreshing about the air inside, something she hadn't realized she'd missed. The first day she'd gone, she'd been unsure, her sneakers squeaking softly on the tile floor as she wandered to the yoga room. But she'd signed up for a class on a whim, unsure of what to expect, only that it was time to do something for herself. By the third class, she'd started to relax into the routine. The stretch of her body, the slow and deliberate movements of each breath. It grounded her, brought her back to a place she had lost somewhere in the midst of decades of sacrifice and duty. Here, there was no expectation. No one knew her as anything other than just another face in a room, and that was fine by her. In this space, she wasn't Margot Whitmore, the mother, the provider, the fixer. She was simply herself. And the best part? She met people. Real people. The kind who didn't look at her like she owed them something. The class was small, a mix of older women and a few younger ones, none of them looking for anything but a peaceful morning. Margot had found herself gravitating toward Alice, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and a soft, warm laugh. They'd chatted a few times after class, and slowly, Margot's new life had begun to take root in the smallest of ways. Over coffee, in the shared space of a yoga mat, where the world felt quieter and more contained than it had in years. Back at home, Margot also made some small adjustments. She'd called Julie at the post office and asked her to forward all her mail to a P.O. box. It was nothing dramatic, nothing conspicuous. It was simply a small move, one that sealed the distance between her and the world she'd spent so many years trying to keep close. Julie didn't question her. She never did. She just did what Margot asked, her voice warm and understanding on the other end of the line. Then Abigail had helped with the utilities at the cabin. Margot had put them in her name only, a quiet yet monumental change. The thought of the cabin, now entirely under her control, was a relief. A space that would always be hers, far removed from the people who'd never understood it. It was a small piece of her past that was finally hers to keep. The first time Margot had set foot in the cabin after the changes, she'd stood at the front door for a long moment, listening to the silence, the absence of other voices. It was peaceful, like a secret she was finally allowed to keep. She'd stepped inside slowly, moving past the old furniture, past the things that had once belonged to someone else, and she'd finally sat down in the old armchair by the window. She'd taken a deep breath, closing her eyes for just a moment, and for the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't remember ever feeling there before: peace. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a sanctuary. Meanwhile, back in the world she'd left behind, Dean and Kelsey were beginning to notice the changes. Not in any direct way, but in the way things had become: quieter, less predictable, more distant. They bickered more. It had always been there, a subtle undercurrent of dissatisfaction, but now it was out in the open. "I don't get it," Kelsey had said one evening as Margot's absence grew more obvious. "She's just gone quiet." Dean had been staring at his phone when she spoke, his fingers tapping against the screen absent-mindedly. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, it was with a certain weight to his voice that Kelsey hadn't expected. "No, Kelsey," he had said, finally looking up at her, his expression tired. "She's not punishing us. She's just gone quiet." The words hung between them for a moment, a kind of cold understanding settling in. Kelsey opened her mouth to protest, but she didn't have the words. Not anymore. And in that silence, Margot felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just quiet. She wasn't just pulling away. She was creating space for herself. A space where they no longer had a place, where they no longer had the right to demand anything from her. It felt good, this new routine. It felt like finally becoming the person she had always been, before she had been buried under expectations, obligations, and the constant need to please. And so, Margot walked through the days that followed with a kind of quiet resolve. The world outside moved at its usual pace, but in her life, it was different. She was different. And that was exactly what she needed. It was late afternoon when Abigail's email came through. The subject line was simple, the words clipped and direct. "FD Duadi," Kelsey Whitmore's request. Margot had been sitting at her kitchen table, sipping from the mug of tea that had become her constant companion, the warm liquid soothing the sharp edge of the quiet. The light outside was beginning to dim, casting a golden glow through the window, but inside the house, the air was still, almost heavy with the weight of the choices she had made. The kettle was silent now, the hum of the house itself providing a kind of soundtrack to her thoughts. She opened the email. Kelsey's words were as careful as they were insincere. She had been concerned about Margot's well-being, and in that tone, all measured politeness and undertones of skepticism, she had reached out to Abigail. Her email claimed to be about ensuring Margot's mental clarity, the kind of concern that masked an agenda. The request, as Margot read it, was simple: to check that Margot was still fit to manage her own affairs. Her fingers paused on the keyboard, the cursor hovering over the message. It was, Margot thought, exactly what she'd been expecting. The request had come at the right moment, just as the trust in her choices were beginning to take full effect, just as Kelsey could no longer ignore the changes. But it was also a sign that she still thought Margot could be manipulated, that the control could be wrested back somehow. Margot wasn't surprised by the email, but she was disappointed. Kelsey had never understood the weight of what she was doing. She had never understood how the game had already shifted, how the rules had changed, and how Margot no longer needed to explain herself. As the email sat open in front of her, Margot could almost hear Kelsey's voice, high-pitched, feigning concern, asking about her mental clarity, as if she hadn't been perfectly clear about her intentions all along. It made Margot's jaw tighten. This wasn't about concern. This was about control. With a quiet exhale, Margot clicked on Abigail's forwarded message and read it carefully. Abigail's reply was short, efficient, and to the point. It was clear Abigail understood the implications of what Kelsey was trying to do, even if she wasn't saying it outright. Margot didn't need her to. She knew exactly how to handle it. She moved swiftly, her fingers already moving to respond. There was no hesitation now. Margot had already anticipated this. She had already set the gears in motion, taking the steps to ensure that there would be no question about her control over her own life, over her own legacy. She had known Kelsey would push, would attempt to undermine her decisions, and now it was time to make it clear that the boundaries were set. Margot opened her trust documents, her eyes skimming over the clauses she had written with careful precision. It wasn't just about keeping Kelsey at arm's length. It was about creating an airtight barrier that no one could cross. She'd already made changes, adjusting the beneficiaries and the trustees. Now she added the final clause, one that would be impossible to contest. She typed it out, each word deliberate, each sentence exact. Kelsey Whitmore shall be barred from any role, involvement, or access to any of the assets, accounts, or decisions under the terms of this trust. This clause is non-negotiable and non-revocable under any circumstances. Margot read the words over several times, the finality of them sinking deep into her bones. This wasn't just about the money, the assets, or the properties. It was about sending a message. Kelsey would no longer have a say. She would no longer have control. Once the clause was added, Margot signed it, her signature sharp and clear at the bottom of the document. She clicked Save and stood up from the table, her hands steady, but her heart beating faster now. She had done it. The trust was sealed, the change irreversible. She gathered the papers, placed them in an envelope, and called Abigail. The phone rang only once before Abigail answered, her tone professional but with a trace of familiarity. "It's done," Margot said without preamble, her voice firm, unyielding. Abigail was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Good. I'll have it notarized first thing tomorrow, and the filing will be official." "Thank you," Margot said. She didn't need anything more. There was no need for further discussion. Abigail had understood the stakes from the beginning. After the call ended, Margot stood in her kitchen for a moment, the weight of the decision settling on her like a cloak. She didn't feel the weight of regret, or even the satisfaction of winning. It was something else entirely. It was the feeling of having put everything in its place, of having finally taken control of the narrative in her own life. Her phone buzzed again. A new text from Dean. "Is everything okay? Kelsey's worried." Margot didn't even look at the message for a full minute. She simply set the phone down beside her, her fingers curling slightly against the edge of the counter. There was no need to respond. Dean didn't need an explanation. The message could stay unread. In the silence that followed, Margot could feel it, the space she had created, the boundaries she had set. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new, something that could never be undone. And if they tried to contest it, well, Margot had already ensured that it would bury them. For the first time in a long time, Margot felt a sense of calm that wasn't tethered to anyone but herself. It was hers, all of it, and she wasn't going to let go. Kelsey's post appeared late one Friday night, as if timed deliberately to coincide with the quiet of the weekend. Margot had been sitting at her kitchen table, the soft flicker of candlelight casting shadows on the walls, when she saw it. The notification popped up on her phone, the name Kelsey Whitmore flashing across the screen. Margot didn't immediately open the post. She already knew what it would say. She had been expecting it, and yet there was a cold, uncomfortable certainty that crept up her spine. Kelsey's words were as polished as they were dramatic. It was a long post, a detailed, seemingly heartfelt plea for understanding, framed by a story about how her mother-in-law, Margot, had changed and grown distant. How she was no longer the warm, giving woman she once was. How she had shut everyone out, refused to be a part of family gatherings, and withdrawn from those who had always relied on her. Kelsey positioned herself as the victim, the misunderstood daughter-in-law who was simply trying to help, only to be met with cold silence. And then, with a flourish, the final paragraph, the most damning one, framed Margot as mentally unstable. I've tried to reach out to her. I don't know what's happening, but something's not right. I'm worried about her, but no one else seems to see it. Maybe she's just tired, or maybe it's something more. If anyone has seen or heard from her, please reach out. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The subtext was clear. Margot was unwell. It wasn't just about the money or the trust anymore. It was a personal attack, designed to make Margot look like someone who needed pity, not respect. Margot didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her hands folding calmly in her lap. She'd expected this. Kelsey had always been good at manipulating the narrative, painting herself as the victim, even when the truth was much darker. Margot didn't need to dignify it with a reply, but there was something else, something that had been happening quietly behind the scenes. Julie had already sent her a message, a screenshot of Kelsey's post, with a simple note. I got this one. Julie had always been the kind of person who didn't let things slide. Her loyalty ran deep, and she'd been watching Kelsey's social media for months now, noticing the cracks in the facade. Margot wasn't surprised to hear that Julie had already contacted some of the other women from her yoga class. They were quick to share the post among their own circles, and soon enough, the screenshots were in Margot's inbox. She stared at the images for a moment, the screen lighting her face as she scrolled through the reactions. The comments were a mix of sympathy and skepticism. Some of them were from people who barely knew Margot, but felt an odd connection to her story. A few women who had known Kelsey from high school had written a comment with a wry tone. Seems like Kelsey has a lot to say these days. Margot's been quiet for months, but we all know why. It was clear. Kelsey's sympathy act was falling flat. Her carefully crafted victimhood didn't have the weight she thought it did. Still, Margot remained offline. She had made it a point not to engage with Kelsey's narrative in public. This was a battle fought in silence. The people who mattered, the people who really understood her, were already on her side. The next day, Abigail sent a message, confirming the legal measures she had set in place. I've prepared cease and desist letters. If Kelsey's posts become more specific or malicious, we'll send them. She can't keep making these kinds of accusations without legal consequences. Margot's lips curved slightly as she read the text. She didn't need to send a letter now, but knowing Abigail had it ready brought a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this. They would handle it quietly, efficiently. And then, the doorbell rang. Margot opened it to find Dean standing on the other side, his hands shoved in his coat pockets, a look of unease on his face. His eyes were tired, like he hadn't slept well for days. I think Kelsey's scared, he said, his voice low, the words hanging between them like a thread ready to snap. Margot didn't answer immediately. She just watched him for a moment, the familiar discomfort of his presence settling into the room. She knew what he meant. Kelsey wasn't just upset, she was rattled. She had played her hand, and now it was starting to backfire. The consequences were inevitable, and Kelsey was feeling the heat. Dean shifted on his feet, looking everywhere but at her. She's worried about you, he added, though there was an uncertainty in his voice. It wasn't the usual defensive tone he took when talking about Kelsey. There was something else now. Margot finally spoke, her voice steady and calm. "Kelsey's worried about herself," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "She's always worried about herself." Dean opened his mouth as if to argue but stopped. The words didn't come. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his feet before meeting her gaze again. "I'm not sure I understand what's going on, but I'm worried about you too," he admitted quietly. Margot met his gaze and allowed the silence to settle for a long moment. She knew what he was asking, what he was hoping for. But the truth was simple. She was done explaining, done with the constant push and pull of their relationship. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "I'm fine, Dean. I'm better than I've been in a long time." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave a stiff nod and turned to leave. But before he could get far, Margot added one more thing, her voice low but firm. "And you'll be fine too. Eventually, you'll see why all of this was necessary." Dean didn't turn back, but his shoulders slumped slightly as he walked down the driveway, his footsteps heavy in the snow. Margot stood in the doorway, watching him go, a strange sense of finality settling over her. The door clicked softly as she closed it. Inside, the quiet returned, and it felt like freedom. 2 days passed before Margot heard from Dean. The silence between them had stretched long, comfortable even, like the quiet after a storm when the sky is still, but the air is thick with unspoken things. It had been a soft kind of distance, the kind that wrapped itself around her like an old, familiar blanket. But it was broken now, cracked open by the letter she had sealed herself. She knew that Dean would read it soon, probably as soon as he got home. He would open it in the quiet of his living room, probably after a long day, sitting in the chair where he used to sink into a comfort he'd never truly understood. The paper would feel stiff in his hands, its edges sharp like the finality in her words. Margot hadn't written the letter with malice. She hadn't written it with anger or regret. It was, in fact, the calmest thing she had ever put on paper. She had set it aside the night she'd written it, not sure if she'd even send it. But she had. And now it was out of her hands. It was final. Inside the envelope, the words were clean, cold even, like an accounting of things that had already been lost. She had explained the changes to the trust, the ones she had put in place weeks ago. Everything was clear. The role Dean once played, the support she had given, all of it had been reevaluated. She had said what needed to be said, but she'd said it without emotion. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't apologizing. There was no softness in the letter, only facts. Margot had written, "Dean, I have made changes to the trust. I have revised the beneficiaries, and I have amended the conditions under which the assets will be distributed. You will no longer have any claim to these assets upon my passing. The role you once held is no longer yours. My decision is final, and my reasons for this are personal. I will always be your mother, but I will not always be your resource. The emotional and financial support I once provided will not continue indefinitely. I have made this choice for myself, as I must. This is not an act of punishment, nor is it a result of anything other than my own need to take control over what is mine. I ask that you respect my wishes." Margot. She had signed it neatly, no flourish, no extra words. Just a clean end to what had become an ongoing misunderstanding. It had taken everything for her to send it, to not simply keep the letter tucked away somewhere in a drawer where no one would have to confront the truth. But she knew it was the only way. Dean needed to understand, not her reasons, but the shift in the power dynamic. The moment when she stopped giving and started taking. The moment when she stopped explaining herself. Dean's response didn't come immediately. 2 days passed, and the phone remained silent. The silence stretched in the house, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Margot sat in her cabin by the fire, reading books she had forgotten about, sipping tea she had made just for herself. The days passed slowly, peacefully, and she began to feel something she hadn't in years: relief. It was as if she had shed an old skin, and now she was finally free to breathe. But then, as the last light of day flickered out behind the trees, the doorbell rang. The sound was soft at first, like the tapping of a bird's foot on a window pane, but it was enough to disrupt the quiet. Margot stood from the chair, setting her book aside. She didn't need to check the peephole. She knew who it was. When she opened the door, there he was, Dean, standing in the fading light of the evening, his face drawn, his posture stiff. He held a small thermos in his hand, the top slightly askew. His gaze was tentative, unsure. "I brought tea," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been. Margot didn't move at first. She simply looked at him, the weight of the past 2 days hanging between them. The way he stood there, awkwardly holding the thermos like it was an offering, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't angry, not like he usually was. He wasn't demanding, but he was still trying to find his way back in. She stepped aside without saying anything, allowing him to enter. He hesitated for a moment, then walked in, setting the thermos on the table by the window, the steam rising from the top. "Thank you," Margot said simply, her voice calm but unyielding. Dean didn't sit down right away. Instead, he lingered near the door, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes searching her face as though looking for some sign, some clue to unravel what was happening between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I think Kelsey's scared." Margot didn't react immediately. She didn't give him anything to latch onto. She simply stood there, watching him as the silence filled the space. She wasn't about to explain herself again. She wasn't going to soothe him with empty reassurances. He had made his choices, and now it was his turn to face them. "I'm not," she said after a long pause. "But I think she is." Dean's mouth opened as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, he looked away, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last traces of daylight were disappearing behind the trees. Margot remained standing, feeling the weight of his quiet in the room. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the soft hum of the cabin around them. Then, with a quiet breath, Margot spoke again, her words simple and final. "I've done what I needed to do. You'll understand someday." Dean's gaze met hers again, but it was different now. There was no anger, no defensiveness. There was only understanding, a quiet, reluctant understanding. He didn't stay long. A few more minutes passed, and then he stood up, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor as he walked to the door. "I'll see you later," he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence, the usual need to fix things. Margot didn't reply. Instead, she just closed the door behind him, the soft click of it echoing in the stillness of the cabin. For the first time in years, Margot felt the weight lift completely. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to explain. She was done. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly, utterly free. The letter arrived on a crisp Thursday afternoon, just as the sun began to slip below the horizon. It was an ordinary envelope, plain white, with no frills, no elaborate markings, just the kind of document that could easily be overlooked in a stack of bills or junk mail. But inside, it held the weight of everything that had shifted between them. Margot had known it was coming. She had anticipated this moment, the final step in the process. The trust was irrevocable now. The changes she had made were no longer just hers to carry. They were public, tangible. They would be acknowledged, even if the people they were meant for didn't like it. She didn't watch as the courier rang the doorbell, didn't need to see the slip of paper left behind. Margot had already arranged for it. Abigail's office had taken care of everything. Clean, precise, no room for misinterpretation. And now the time had come for Kelsey to face the consequences of her actions. The notice was clear. Kelsey's name had been removed from all roles in the trust. She was barred from any involvement in any future decisions regarding the assets. No involvement, no claim, no access to any funds. The clauses were direct, written with the kind of legal precision that left no room for argument. It was done. The finality of it was unmistakable. Kelsey would be forced to confront it, and there would be no room for excuses or misunderstandings. Margot felt nothing as she signed the final document. No satisfaction, no anger. Just the quiet release of having set things right, at least in her own mind. The letter would be served cleanly, without fanfare. Abigail had already made sure that everything was in order. Margot watched the fire crackling in the hearth at the cabin, the soft crackle of the logs filling the room as she sat back in the old armchair, the warmth of the flames slowly spreading through her. She had been coming here more often lately, choosing the solitude of the cabin over the distractions of the house. Here, there was nothing but the quiet sound of the wind outside, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the flickering shadows cast by the fire. With a deep breath, Margot grabbed a skewer and impaled a marshmallow, the soft white fluff glowing orange in the firelight as she slowly rotated it. Her thoughts drifted as she watched it brown, then blacken, then fall apart in a cloud of sticky sweetness. She didn't need to roast marshmallows. She didn't need to be alone in the cabin either. But it was exactly what she wanted. The silence felt comforting. More than that, it felt like ownership. This was her space, her choice, her time. There was no need to explain, no need to justify. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet. Margot didn't move to answer it, instead watching the flickering light of the fire. She knew who it was. Julie had sent her a message, a simple postcard, delivered by the same courier that had brought the notice. "This is better than a movie." Margot smiled faintly to herself as she read the words, her fingers brushing over the paper. Julie always knew how to make her laugh, even in the midst of everything. They hadn't spoken much in the last few days, but the connection was still there. The loyalty, the understanding. Margot snapped the postcard in half, letting it fall onto the table beside her, and returned to her marshmallow. She didn't need to dwell on it. Julie had already seen through it all. "It's just paperwork," Margot muttered to herself, staring into the flames. Her words felt hollow, but they weren't. They were everything. Paperwork and boundaries. That was all it was. A shift of ownership. A line in the sand drawn with careful precision, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. A feeling of detachment washed over her, a strange calmness in the face of the finality of it all. She had always been the one to carry the burden, the one who gave, who supported, who worked and worked and worked until she had nothing left. And now? Now, the weight had shifted. Now, it was someone else's turn to deal with the consequences. Margot's phone buzzed again, but she didn't need to check it. The moment had passed. The ball was no longer in her court. It was in theirs. Kelsey would try to challenge it. She would fight. But the truth was, Margot had already anticipated that, and the paperwork she had set in motion was more than just a shield. It was her statement. And Kelsey, with all her dramatic pleas and twisted narratives, was left with nothing but empty words. Dean's absence hung like a cloud over the evening, but even that felt like progress. He wasn't here to ask for explanations, to plead with her. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He was letting her be. And for once, that was all she needed. Margot stood up from the chair. The marshmallow now burned beyond recognition, but she didn't mind. The process was the point, the change, the choice. The door opened to the outside world and she stepped outside, the cold night air wrapping around her like a welcome embrace. The stars were bright in the sky, each one a distant light, indifferent to the dramas of the earth below. Margot breathed in deeply, letting the night air fill her lungs. There was nothing left to fix. She smiled to herself, the night stretching ahead, wide and empty, waiting for her to fill it as she saw fit. Margot sat in the back of the community hall, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the young students began to read their scholarship essays. The space was familiar, a place she had attended countless meetings and events over the years, but tonight, it felt different. The air seemed thicker, more charged, as if the room itself knew something had changed. The scholarship fund she had redirected part of her estate to had finally come to fruition, and now it was being honored. The money wasn't for Dean. It wasn't for Kelsey. It was for local students, each one with a story, a dream, a promise of potential. Margot's mother's name graced the award, a quiet tribute to a woman who had understood sacrifice in ways Margot only began to fully comprehend as she grew older. It was a small ceremony. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate presentations, just a group of high school students, their faces wide with excitement as they stood at the podium reading the words they had poured their hearts into. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, the soft hum of conversation fading into the background as Margot listened to each young voice with rapt attention. She hadn't expected to feel this way. After everything, the distance, the decisions, the cutting off of old ties, she hadn't expected to be moved. But as one girl stood up to read her essay, Margot felt the tightness in her chest loosen. The girl's words spoke of family, of perseverance, of rising above circumstances. "I'll remember this forever," the girl said at the end, her voice trembling with emotion. Her eyes flickered to the scholarship plaque on the wall behind the stage. "This is going to change my life." Margot blinked, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She knew it wasn't the scholarship itself that would change the girl's life, but what it represented. The opportunity, the hope, the belief that someone, even a stranger, had seen her potential and chosen to invest in it. That was what the trust had always been about for Margot. It had been about investing in others, giving, giving, and giving, until there was nothing left for herself. But now, things had shifted. The scholarship fund was the first real step in Margot's new direction. The first sign that the resources she had accumulated, her years of labor and sacrifice, would be used to build something for others. Not for Dean, not for Kelsey, but for those who would truly appreciate it. She watched as each student stepped forward, one by one, to receive their award. Their faces were bright, full of promise, and for the first time in a long time, Margot felt something like pride. This was her gift, a legacy that wasn't tied to blood, to obligation, or to the weight of family history. It was a gift that would keep on giving, long after the money was spent, long after the ceremony ended. It was a gift of knowledge, of opportunity, of possibility. Margot's gaze flickered to the front of the room, where the empty seats where Dean and Kelsey should have been sat quietly, untouched. They hadn't come. She had known they wouldn't. They were too wrapped up in their own world, too focused on their grievances to see the bigger picture. They couldn't understand the change, couldn't see what was being built in the silence. But Margot didn't need them there. She didn't need their approval. The students had filled the void, their voices a reminder that she had made the right choice. At the end of the ceremony, Margot stood up slowly, her chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. She moved toward the exit, not with urgency, but with purpose. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, the smell of fresh grass and rain mingling in the air. Julie was waiting for her, as usual, standing by the side of the building, arms crossed in a casual, familiar way. She had been with Margot through all of this, a quiet constant, never pushing, never demanding, just there, offering her support when needed. "Well?" Julie asked, raising an eyebrow. "How was it?" Margot smiled faintly, looking back toward the community hall, where the last of the students were filing out, their voices rising in celebration. "It was good," she said simply. "It feels right." Julie grinned. "You know, I thought this whole thing was a little crazy at first, but seeing it in action, seeing these kids, well, it's better than I expected." "It's better than anyone expected," Margot replied, her voice quieter now. "It's not about them. It's about the future." Julie chuckled, shaking her head. "You sure know how to pull off a plot twist, don't you?" Margot glanced at her friend, her smile softening. "I suppose I do." Julie handed her a small package. "A little something for you," she said, her tone playful. Margot opened the small box, revealing a simple silver pendant. It was delicate, shaped like a leaf, with intricate detailing along the edges. "For the quiet one who won," Julie said with a wink. Margot's fingers traced the smooth edges of the pendant, a small, intimate gift that spoke volumes. She didn't need anything extravagant. This was all she had ever wanted, to be seen for who she truly was, for what she had accomplished, without needing validation from the people who had never really understood her. "That's perfect," Margot whispered, her voice barely audible. They stood there together, the world around them still moving, still turning, but Margot knew she had made her mark. She had created something that no one could take away. Not Kelsey, not Dean, not anyone. And as the night unfolded around them, Margot knew that the gift she had given, both to the students and to herself, was something that would last long after the last vestige of her old life had faded away. It was a new chapter. It was freedom. It was hers. And nothing would change that. The diner was empty when Margot walked in, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her head, casting an artificial glow on the cracked leather booths and vinyl seats. The air smelled faintly of grease and coffee, the kind of diner scent that clung to everything: jackets, hair, clothes, making it feel like a place where time stood still. Margot didn't need to look around. She already knew where he was sitting. Dean was at the far booth, the one by the window. He always chose it, not because it offered the best view, but because it was the one that let him sit facing the door, the one he could observe from. He hadn't changed that. She hesitated for a moment, standing in the doorway, just watching him. He was staring at the table, his hands clasped loosely, his elbows resting on the laminated surface. When he looked up, his eyes met hers, soft, unsure. There was no anger anymore, no bravado, just a quiet resignation, a weariness she hadn't expected. Margot didn't smile, didn't do anything to soften the moment. She just walked over, slid into the seat across from him, and let the silence settle between them. Dean shifted in his seat, glancing out the window for a moment, then back at her. He didn't know what to say, and Margot didn't need him to say anything. There was no need for small talk, no need to pretend they could pick up where they left off. "I didn't think you'd come," Margot said softly, breaking the stillness. Dean didn't respond right away. Instead, he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching the steam curl upward. The weight of what had happened between them, the trust, the changes, the distance, hung heavy in the air. It was too big to ignore now, too real to avoid. "I didn't know what else to do," Dean finally said, his voice low, the words almost lost in the buzz of the diner. I'm trying to understand." Margot nodded, her fingers resting lightly on the table, the edges of the wood smooth under her touch. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. It was just a conversation that needed to happen, one that had been postponed for far too long. "You said I should sit quietly," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I did." Dean's gaze flickered to hers, and his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't speak immediately, the weight of the words falling heavily on both of them. "That wasn't what I meant," he said, his voice thick with something Margot couldn't quite place. Margot met his gaze, her expression steady, unwavering. "But it was how you felt." Dean's shoulders slumped slightly and he dropped his gaze to his coffee cup. The soft clink of the spoon stirring in the mug was the only sound for a few moments. "Yeah," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess it was. It's just hard. All of this is hard." It was hard for him, Margot knew, but it was harder for her. She had been the one to bear the weight, the one who had carried everything without asking for anything in return. And now, she was simply tired of carrying it. "You can't fix this, Dean," she said, her words quiet but firm. "You can't fix what's been broken. I'm not asking you to, I'm just telling you what's necessary." Dean nodded, but he didn't look up. There was a shift in the air now, a subtle change in their dynamic. The wall that had been between them for so long had finally cracked, not because of anything they said, but because it was time for the silence to speak for them. Margot wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking retribution. She had already done what she needed to do. The decisions she had made were hers to live with, and if Dean couldn't understand that, then that was his burden to carry, not hers. "I've done everything I could," Margot continued, her voice steady, the words coming easily now. "But I can't keep sacrificing myself for you, for Kelsey. I can't keep pretending like things are going to be different when they're not." Dean didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. He just sat there, the silence between them stretching long. And for the first time in a long time, Margot felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Peace. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't about being right. It was simply about the freedom that came with having done what she knew she had to do, even if it meant walking away from the people she loved. "I'm sorry," Dean said suddenly, his voice rough, like the words were being dragged out of him. "I'm sorry for everything." Margot nodded again, the gesture small, but it was enough. "I know, but you can't keep apologizing for the things I've already forgiven." There was a long pause, one that felt different from the silence that had hung between them for so long. Dean shifted again, glancing up at her, his eyes tired but somehow softer now. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly, his voice vulnerable, exposed in a way Margot had never heard before. "You don't need to," she replied, the words simple but final. "You just need to let it be." And with that, the conversation shifted once more. They didn't need to fill the silence with more words. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. Dean's expression softened, and for the first time, Margot saw a flicker of clarity in his eyes. He didn't stay much longer. There was no need for any dramatic goodbyes or promises that neither of them could keep. He paid for the coffee, stood up, and left, his footsteps heavy as they echoed in the empty diner. Margot stayed where she was, letting the silence of the booth envelop her once more. Outside, the world continued on, just as it always had, just as it always would. But for Margot, the change had already happened. She was free, and she wasn't going back. The cabin was quiet, and Margot was perfectly fine with that. Christmas morning came and went like a whisper. She had made herself tea and curled up in the same armchair where she had spent countless evenings over the past months, watching the flames flicker and pop in the hearth. The snow outside was thick, piling up on the ground in soft, unhurried drifts, covering the world in a blanket of white. It was the kind of snow that made everything outside look still, untouched. Just like her life now. The calendar on the wall ticked past December 25th, but Margot didn't feel the weight of the holiday. She had long stopped buying into the demands it made, the expectations of family dinners, of noisy gatherings, of togetherness. There were no phone calls from Dean or Kelsey, no last-minute scrambling for gifts or making sure everyone had what they needed. It was just her. And that was exactly how she wanted it. The packages started arriving a few days before Christmas, one by one, stacking up at the door. She didn't rush to open them. She wasn't expecting anyone. But as she picked up each box, she felt the familiar sense of calm settle over her. The first was from Julie. A box of cozy wool socks, thick and soft, with a note that read, "For your quiet winters. Enjoy." Margot smiled at the thoughtfulness. Julie had always known exactly what would bring comfort. She opened the second one, a set of fine pens, black ink, sleek and elegant. Abigail had sent that one, along with a note that said, "For the new you, keep writing." Margot's fingers traced the smooth surface of the pens, and she felt a quiet appreciation for Abigail's understated support. It wasn't about anything grand, just a little nudge to keep moving forward. The third box was from herself. Margot smiled wryly as she lifted it from the pile. She had ordered it herself with no hesitation, no one to question her choices. Inside was a prepaid getaway voucher for a quiet resort she had been eyeing. No flights to catch, no obligations, just a few days away. Alone, somewhere new. No family dinners, no expectations. She carefully laid everything out on the table, each item representing something she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Peace, quiet, autonomy. No shouting, no crumbs left on the table, no passive-aggressive remarks thrown across dinner plates. Just a soft, steady rhythm of her own choosing. By mid-afternoon, Margot had already finished her tea. The fire had burned low, and she felt an unfamiliar kind of contentment. The quiet was hers to keep, and for the first time in ages she didn't feel like she was fighting for it. It was a kind of liberation she hadn't known she needed. Margot got up, put on her coat, and stepped outside into the snow. The cold air bit at her skin, but it felt good, sharp, like it was clearing away the remnants of everything that had held her down. She walked through the snow, her boots crunching softly with each step. The silence of the woods wrapped around her like a soft, protective veil. There were no cars parked at the end of the driveway, no voices calling to her. It was just her, the snow, and the quiet of the world she had carved out for herself. It felt warm somehow, even though the temperature was far from it. There was something about being alone, about choosing to be alone. That filled her in a way nothing else ever had. It was her space, her decision, her peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, finding a text from Abigail. "Best investment you ever made." Margot smiled at the text, her heart light. She typed a quick reply. "It's not the money, it's the peace." She hit send and tucked the phone back into her pocket, not waiting for a reply. She didn't need one. Everything had already been said. Everything was already understood. As she walked back to the cabin, the evening light began to fade, the world around her sinking into soft twilight. The air was still, the only movement the slow drift of snow from the branches overhead. She stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around her like an embrace. She closed the door behind her, letting the quiet settle back into the space. The fire was still burning, low now, but enough to keep the chill at bay. Margot sank into her armchair once again, the marshmallow she had left on the coffee table still untouched. She picked it up and stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a quiet smile, She tossed it into the fire. It melted away with a soft, satisfying hiss. At Christmas dinner, her son had said, "Just sit quietly." And so she had. And the gifts? They arrived addressed only to her.